part one, about the third Havana Biennial. Third Havana Biennial was co-curated by Gerardo Mosquera, an advisor at Rijksakademie, and is edited by After All Books, an initiative of different institutions and universities, but also under the impulse of Charles Asst, also former advisor of Rijksakademie and currently director of the Van Abbe Museum. This evening is taking part in a collaboration between Rijksakademie and the Stedelijk Museum as public programs co-organized by Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam and Rijksakademie Amsterdam. I would like to thank very much Hendrik Volkers from the Stedelijk Museum, curator of public programs at the museum, to co-organize or mostly organize this event, and making also possible that so many people come into these walls that have too often be considered as ivory tower, which they are not, as we have been proving in the last time with a series of public events focusing on the discourse on contemporary art, amongst others also the Rijksakademie live events that started last year. So we are very, very happy to welcome the Stedelijk Museum at Rijksakademie in this collaboration for a series of, I know at this moment, 4 evenings that are organized collaboratively. And tonight I'm really, really happy to, personally I'm happy to see this book, because I was very curious about this book, and knowing Gerardo's work and also Gerardo's work as an author for Ineva, amongst others. I'm really, really happy that we at Rijksakademie can have this launch here. Thanks a lot, and I would like to give the word to Hendrik Volkers.
Philippe, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, in which you already told indeed something about the location in which this program takes place. Perhaps to reiterate briefly, but first of all to first extend a very warm welcome to you all. It's getting very busy in the back, so I still hope you can find a seat. There are some seats here in the front. And a very warm welcome, of course, to our speakers, who I am so happy that they accepted our invitation to be here. This event, the official Dutch book launch of the After All exhibition series book, Making Art Global Part 1, the third Havana Biennial 1989. It's actually the second After All book that was launched in collaboration with the Stedelijk. The first one being launched in December of 2010, which was exhibiting the new art, and I'm very happy that we can extend this series, in particular in this series that we're doing with the Rijksakademie, called Stedelijk at Rijksakademie. Philippe already mentioned we're going to do several events here. This one is the first. We continue in the spring of 2012 with dialogues with major contemporary artists, so I hope that I may welcome you back then. I'm not going to speak for long because we have a very full program, as some of you may have seen. First, we're going to have an introduction to the book by Annie Fletcher. Then the first lecture. This is maybe a good time to ask you to turn off your mobile phones as well. Then we're going to continue this evening with the first lecture, Rachel Weisz, coming from Chicago, and who wrote the main essay in the book that we're discussing this evening. We'll have a short break at 10 to 9 until approximately 9 o'clock, and we'll continue the evening with Gerardo Mosquera. And we'll end the evening with a discussion with all the speakers, also moderated by Annie. I would like to thank some people. First and foremost, the Rijksakademie, of course, for so warmly welcoming us in their house. It's really an honor to work with you, and I look forward to the months to come, and of course, hopefully, the years to come that we can do exciting things with the two institutions. In particular, Tijntje for all her help and advice and everything. I would also like to thank After All for allowing to launch this book here, and for everyone who took part in making this evening happen. Annie, I will give the floor to you. Just briefly introduce Annie. Annie Fletcher is a curator of exhibitions at the Van Museum in Eindhoven. Recent exhibitions include solo projects with Joe Barr, Jutta Kuter, Sareth Wynne Evans, and many more. And she was also involved in the long-term project Becoming or Being Dutch with Charles Ashe, which ran from 2006 until 2009. Fletcher was also co-founder of the platform If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution with Frederike Bergholz. Well, she's done many, many more. It's quite a long list, so I encourage you to go online and check her website for the rest of her bio. Annie, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. It's a wonderful occasion to welcome the new participants to the Rijks and to just really celebrate a kind of chance to look very seriously, which I think all of these After All books do, at a kind of important legacy in art history around curating, what it is to make exhibitions, what it is to construct a kind of encounter around art. The evening tonight, I don't really want to spend too long sort of talking about it before we really get into the fantastic possibility of hearing Rachel and Gerardo reflect on what was an extraordinary and become a very historical moment, an important moment known as the Third Havana Biennial in 1989. But it's important also to think about what it is that has been missing in art history for so long, and that is the kind of real deep and serious consideration of the exhibition itself, the exhibition history, which I think many institutions are beginning to start to understand is as important as the legacy and oeuvre of particular artists or particular curators themselves. What is it that constructs that moment, that alchemy of a context, a time, a historical moment, and artworks, and an encounter that happens all together at one moment? So I really think these books, I work in the Van Abbe and Charles Ashe is my boss, but I do have nothing to do with After All, so I'm really happy to kind of heap praise on this enterprise, which I think is super important. After All, as we all know, have been developing a journal for a long time, but in April 2006, they launched 2 new strands of publications to complement the journal. One work and a series of After All critical readers. One work is a library of small books, each title focusing on one important work of contemporary artists through a single text. After All critical readers look at significant areas of modern and contemporary art practice through the commissioning and reprinting of a collection of key texts, artist statements, and manifestos. This new series, of which this is the second book, is entitled Exhibition Histories, and it was launched in 2010 in collaboration with the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. Tonight we will have Rachel Weisz, who wrote this central essay for this particular publication, and I think it's extraordinarily exciting to hear both the motivations behind writing this text, the need to kind of imprint this particular biennial in the history of art somehow, and also, I think extremely interestingly, a kind of new essay from Gerardo Mosquera, which reflects on both possibly his motivations at the time and a looking back on how this exhibition has been read through time and what he might think about it now. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rachel Weisz to give her first and important lecture on this project. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to thank everyone who's put this evening together. It's a pleasure to be here. And you've given me an opportunity to catch up with an old friend, Gerardo, so thank you for that as well. Let me find my presentation here. The images I'll show you are basically pages from the book, and maybe just by way of explaining the visuality of the presentation, I should say that one of the things about doing a history of an exhibition like the Havana Biennial is that you don't have the kinds of resources that you often have. The archival sources, photography, installation floor plans, none of that exists. So there's a fair amount of reconstruction, of going back through anecdotal material, and you can't do an exhibition history in maybe the traditional sense of it. I've been asked to summarize some of the key points I wrote about in the book, and I guess the first among those would be the enormous scope, ambition, and energy of the Biennale in 1989. And here's a list of the participating countries. In its third iteration, the Havana project had expanded to include artists from across what was at the time still called the Third World, who engaged in all kinds of activities with an eclectic public around the city. In its dozens of exhibitions, the Biennale comprised an incredibly polyglot array. The works were made by everyone from artists to artisans, conceptualists to doll makers, from latter-day modernists and polemicists to admirers of Simón Bolívar, and children inventing their own toys. This you can sort of see, these are effigies of Simón Bolívar. And this was an amazing exhibition. There were, I don't know how many of these, about 100 of these that were. And then these are from an exhibition that was done of wire toys made mostly by children, I guess, in 4 or 5 sub-Saharan African countries. Unlike the radial model of a more traditional biennial, the main exhibition was not positioned as the showcase around which the other activities revolved. Instead, it consisted of a field of activity in which conferences, workshops, and public events figured energetically. All of this was held together under the loose thematic umbrella of tradition and contemporaneity, and all of it was put together with a budget and infrastructure that were at most minuscule, and I mean like really minuscule. It was a wide-ranging, heterodox, and rambunctious affair, and my strongest memories of it are of the sense of excitement that was in the air. The Biennale of Havana began as the direct result of one of Fidel Castro's legendary brainstorms, inaugurated under the banner of Cuba's forceful idealism and anti-imperialism. A stalwart advocate of the need for a global forum outside of the mainstream, in which local discourses and aesthetics could grow, the Biennale told a story that was different from the stories offered by international exhibitions elsewhere in the world. As the only biennial operated by an avowedly socialist country, it stood for anti-commercialism and solidarity among artists, for a reciprocal instead of market base of exchange. It offered a model for an alternative practice. The early guiding principles of the Biennale also coincided neatly with ideas that were circulating elsewhere in contemporary art discourse, including the need for an even-handed representation of cultures typically left out of hegemonic international circuits, and the urgency of reimagining the audience for art in order to include a broader slice of the public, to make that audience's role in the art viewing situation more participatory, and to alter the location of the art itself so that it became more interwoven with the fabric of daily life. Havana as such was pretty much in a class by itself, and it quickly acquired a certain cachet for its clarity of vision and for having been there first. The Biennale also arose in synergy with the extraordinary artistic renaissance that took place in Havana during the 1980s. And this is a long topic which I won't have time to talk about, but if people are interested, we can go into it later. Art and the art system in Cuba were in transition. Political dogmatism and compliance had been overturned by a generation of young artists, critics, and curators, and I'll just show you a couple of works, who placed themselves in a contemporary and international rather than a nationalistic context. Changes to the institutional structure and changes in the cultural leadership had created a new flexibility of mission, and Soviet subsidies had created a period of relative prosperity. The era of exporting revolution was largely over, but the era of exporting culture was renewed. The Biennale project existed amidst its own contradictions, however. It was simultaneously a lively, almost anti-programmatic forum for sharing art and ideas across all kinds of divides, and a politically expedient bit of national projection. It was a key initiative in a new political strategy for the Ministry of Culture, repositioning the country in the international arena in the wake of the censorship scandals of the 1970s and the exodus from the port city of Mariel in 1980. Meanwhile, its curators worked from their own agenda of exploring the various meanings and contexts in which contemporary art operated globally. Or to put it another way, they set out to formulate a third worldist cultural proposition not based in the fictions of cohesion. And just a little bit more work from it. Thanks to the Biennale, as the Cuban art historian Magali Espinosa has explained, we've had the opportunity to encounter, first, the work and thought of the most advanced artists, art critics, curators, and visual theoreticians, and second, to contrast it with our own Eastern Marxist-Leninist formation. In the book, I argue that the project of the Biennale, which began in 1984, culminated culturally and curatorially in its third edition in 1989, though it peaked in other terms, including things like institutional solidity, organizational professionalism, and international recognition, somewhat later, probably about 5 years later. The case for 1989 as the most important of its editions stands on the extent and adventurousness of the research that went into it, the freshness of its curatorial propositions, the energy of the event, the richness of the dialogues that it established, and its timing, not least, opening a few months after the Paris exhibition Magiciens de la Terre, which had claimed to be the first worldwide exhibition ever. Exhibition of contemporary art, anyhow. The Biennale in 1989 was a gigantic montage comprised of a central exhibition and what the curators called four nuclei, which were clustered explorations of specific themes in 24 small exhibitions, and a robust program of debates, meetings, and workshops, all of which stripped the central exhibition of its special authority. Display methodologies were simple, without elaborate mise-en-scène or intricate narrative strategies. The venues included a scattershot array of spaces, from the National Museum to a refashioned colonial-era fortress, special interest museums, galleries, cultural centers, magazine offices, printmaking studios, parks, and art schools in neighborhoods and commercial districts across the city. Along with its exhibitions, the Biennale included open-air fashion shows, concerts, performances, and events of widely diverse sorts, including a workshop staged on the streets of Old Havana, making gigantic prints using a steamroller as a press, which was really fun. It was not only a place of specialized interchange, but also a more fully public and permeable space, a kind of organism in which all the parts implicated each other. Both the disavowal of a strongly curatorial authorship and the identification of the event as participatory made for a really dynamic constellation of activities, pulsed with a certain degree of chaos. The Biennale's theme of tradition and contemporaneity suggested an unease with both terms. And this is a poster that Jose Bedia made for the conference that year. An unease with both terms as typically understood, namely as opposites of a sort, and proposed an overall reconsideration of the roots of contemporaneity in regions where modernity had been experienced through the process of colonization. The Biennale then raised important questions not only about the nature of art made outside of the Western market system, but also about its relationship with that system. In place of an either-or formulation, the project tried to account for the realities of a situation in which both tradition and contemporaneity existed simultaneously and in a productively fraught relation. I'll just show you some works. Tradition was conceived in broadly transcultural and contemporary terms and linked to an idea of popular creativity. Traditions in this sense were residual rather than antiquated, and in fact closely related to emergent artistic or cultural forms. Traditions, in other words, were a living force that could be articulated in a contemporary and international idiom, and they're important because they made manifest the complicated history of those cultural encounters with the colonial and post-colonial process. Gives you some sense of the extreme heterogeneity of the show. This approach facilitated and legitimated a third world claim to contemporaneity, recognizing its capacity to originate its own contemporary forms. In parallel fashion, the '89 Biennial insisted on multiple and distinct contemporaneities and on a model of culture that was fundamentally conglomerate and therefore impure and always unfinished. It was a model that allowed for an approach to the local not mired in the archaic and of globality not flattened into homogeneity. The curator's somewhat controversial decision to accept what they called westernized art as the shared language among all the participants mandated a shift from the nation-based idea of culture and, of course, the nation-based idea of traditional biennials to a global perspective. This meant that the Biennale, though still wrapped in third worldist rhetoric, had actually moved beyond that kind of identitarian framework by 1989. Uninterested in an art produced and circulated according to restrictive rules of access and financialized standards of value, the Biennale set out to discover what that art might look like, act like, or aspire to when it was produced in the regions that had an intrinsically critical relation to that foundation. That was one part of it. But along with all that, the fact is that the organizers didn't stick to contemporary art. They strayed into popular creativity of various kinds, not so much claiming it as art, in my view anyhow, as looking for resonances. The Biennale didn't exactly draw an equivalence between those objects and the one made by the artists. And unlike Magicien de la Terre, it didn't orchestrate that convergence under the alibi of some universal creative spirit. It didn't claim every contributor as a magician, but rather as a citizen. And so the zone it sketched was not some neutrally shared terrain, but rather a vexed ground, as much comprised of clashing particularities as of cohering accords. A polemically third worldist project that accepted Western art history as the lingua franca and an exhibition of contemporary art that contravened its own definitions, the Biennale found its urgency in those unresolved tensions. More steamroller. Rejecting the polar options of pure aesthetic versus direct use value, the Biennale began to suggest a range of relations and meanings that complicated and enriched the debate about art's relation to everyday life and to politics. The Biennale was, as I see it, a project of rethinking how art's presence and meanings exist in relation to other cultural forms. In this, it was a challenge to the reductiveness of both a socialist culture of the masses model and a typically high art arena of other biennials. It was more heterodox than either of those two alternatives, and also, I think, more interested in the operations of cultural expressions than in their classification. In the book, I argue that the Biennale was pioneering in its discursive method and shape, in which the actual display of artworks was part of a much broader project of research and production of knowledge. It's worth noting that the approach they took was obviously congruent with a lot of artistic practice, starting at least in the 1960s, which had focused more on the context in which the work was seen than on the object of art itself. Havana's interest in the discussion around the exhibition and in the exhibition's presence within the city all seems congruent to me with this line of thinking. The Biennale's discursive turn was one of a handful of ideas about curating large international exhibitions that have since then been recognized as key innovations, including the substitution of a large thematically organized exhibition for the previous practice of national representation, the elimination of prizes, and therefore of the suggestion that an exhibition was a competition rather than a conversation, and the dispersal of the project into smaller clusters of exhibitions, workshops, debates, and so forth, breaking the centralized logic and material dominion of the main exhibition. It was a porous organism, intricately linked to the life of the city and its inhabitants, and activating space rather than a vetted and formalized place. So you get the idea about this show. I've also been asked to talk a little bit about the editorial logic of the book, so I'll say a couple of things about that. As I mentioned, it was a little complicated to try and translate the Biennale into the form of a book. In practical terms, there's just not much documentation available, either in the form of installation photographs, and I should mention that I think every single photograph in the book is a snapshot that Louise Kamnitzer or I took, never imagining that anyone would have, any use for those subsequently. So our apologies for that. So there are no installation photographs. There are no available institutional archives. The kind of detailed information that the After All editors would have liked to include, things like an exhibition floor plan or budget or logistical information or diplomatic correspondence or any other kind of contemporaneous traces, just doesn't exist. So first of all, we had to rely a lot on memory through interviews with a variety of people who had been involved in putting the show together, including curators, administrators, and participating artists. The interviews were also a way to make present some of the complexity of the political moment in which the Third Biennale was staged. 1989 was, of course, also the year when it became very clear that the so-called special relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union was going to come to an end. In breathtakingly short order, things on the island fell apart, both in economic and psychic terms. The Third Biennale was basically launched amid a national catastrophe, or a sort of blooming national catastrophe. At the same time, it was operating inside of a mounting battle between young Cuban artists and the cultural institutions and even the political leadership of the Communist Party. A string of confrontations over politically charged exhibitions had superheated the atmosphere. Shows had been closed, sympathetic officials had been fired, and things were incredibly tense. A new set of hardline and commercial priorities were embodied in the incoming cultural officials who replaced those who were purged just around the time of the Biennale. And at the Biennale, the controversial works by the young Cubans were safely cordoned off into a side exhibition that had the anodyne title of The Tradition of Humor. The conversations reprinted in the book reflect some of these tensions. Lázaro Saavedra, a key figure in the movement of young artists at the time, provides a somewhat more skeptical view of the Biennale's writ than I've given you here, noting that the idealism of the project was mixed with a dose of realpolitik on the part of many artists, who saw the Biennale as a launch pad as much as anything else, and who also recognized the 1989 iteration in particular as a further site of conflict with state power. This latter dynamic featured centrally in the conversation that's also in the book, with the Peruvian artists Alfredo Marquez and Alex Angeles, who participated that year. While their experience in Cuba was indeed key for them as artists, It was an experience that consisted precisely in leaving the orchestrated spaces of the Bienal in order to enter, along with their peers in Havana, spaces of refusal. Despite this, it's worth noting that the invitation from the Bienal was a crucial legitimation for them as artists, especially as they negotiated the no simpler cultural politics of their own country once they got back home. I also conducted a number of background conversations with some of the Biennale's organizers, including longtime director Jillian Yanis, Beatriz Aulette, who is a well-respected cultural official who got the axe right around then, and Leticia Cordero, a young curator who was mentored by Gerardo Mosquera, among others. So my interest in working with recollections and after-the-fact narrations was to look basically for the different versions that would arise and try and triangulate among them to make the complexities and the contradictions of the event as palpable as possible in the volume. I was also interested in including some text from the Biennale conference, both for the arguments they lay out and to make present the language and feel of the debate at the time. Both in my own recollections and in the conversations I had with a number of participants, the conference was a high point of the Biennale, an exchange with enormous momentum. While many of the Latin American participants already were very familiar with each other's work, the gathering of scholars from so many regions, each of them immersed in parallel but distinct debates over questions of culture in post-colonial settings, made for round after round of animated discussion. As Gita Kapoor later put it, the experience in Havana allowed her to relate to internationalism in a much broader way. The encounter was, in her words, a revelation, in particular for the self-assuredness and panache with which those tricky concepts of modernity, internationalism, and avant-garde were deployed in the service of a critical project. Along similar lines, I was also interested in including a couple of contemporaneous reviews of the Biennale, again to catch the sense of the moment and of the disagreements that it gave rise to. Hence the inclusion of Coco Fusco's angry and critical piece, and also the review by Luis Gamnitzer, which is diametrically opposed in political terms to Fusco's. It's also worth noting that Fusco's review appeared in the Village Voice, published in New York and read by a generally young and progressive audience, while Kamnitzer's piece appeared in Arte en Colombia, at the time the only magazine devoted to Latin American art. Fusco's review, in other words, was aimed at a readership that was presumably supportive of the Cuban state, the Cuban project, even if, in her view, without substantial arguments to back that up. The review serves to disabuse that readership of its political notions through the vehicle of analyzing the state's cultural policy. Kamnitzer, meanwhile, was writing from a perspective much more typical in Latin America, from which the fact of the Cuban state's support of a project like the Biennale was in itself and already reason enough to view it as a vital zone of possibility, regardless of any dark corners. 1989 and its Biennale were a perfect storm of convergences. In national terms, between the sweeping cultural renovation that had been gaining force since the establishment of the Ministry of Culture in 1976, and the public interest that this attracted and animated throughout the city of Havana. And in geopolitical and geocultural terms, concerning the Cuban state's desire to be a third world leader, the desire of the Biennale's curators to engage a more global vision of contemporary art production, and the consolidation of post-colonial theories, advocating the replacement of colonial patterns of center and periphery with more plural and nuanced connective circuits. All of this coincided with a time when in the West, so-called West, multiculturalism was espousing ideas of inclusion and tolerance. The incipient focus on globalization offered a means of recognizing the interconnectedness, for better and for worse, of states, economies, and cultures, and it had begun to stimulate international markets for Cuban and other so-called peripheral cultural productions. Such was the backdrop for the Biennale in 1989. That year was obviously momentous for another reason as well. The Berlin Wall fell down, in fact, just a few days after the Biennale opened. 1989 was the start of an incredibly complex and contradictory transition in Cuban culture, from the artistic efflorescence of the 1980s that had, however, always been looking over its shoulder to the darkness of the 70s, to a crackdown in idioaesthetic terms that ran parallel to a cynical move by the state to repurpose the cultural sector towards commercial rather than revolutionary benefits, and this is obviously something that resonates loudly today. 1989 was the moment when the utopian vision of the Biennale crossed paths with the realization that socialism in Cuba and elsewhere had become an empty shell. In another universe, 1989 was also a time when ideas about exhibition making were changing, thanks to a wave of self-criticism in Western anthropology, which had occasioned a wide-ranging reevaluation of that discipline, and especially of how its principles were made manifest in museum collections and displays. A so-called new museology, which critiqued the naturalization of museums as neutralized sites of fixed knowledge, was being consolidated, and questions about the nature of the art institution, which had been posed incessantly since at least the 1960s, were also beginning to be internalized into a more self-conscious curatorial practice. The third Biennale took place at the confluence of all these streams and took them up with an optimism and sense of possibility that was characteristic of the cultural energies in Cuba at the time. The double mandate to include the excluded and to rethink the meanings of art in excluded zones both coincided and conflicted with policy directions on the island, setting the stage for eventual co-option and absorption. But that mostly came later, and in 1989 the project was at its apogee. The Biennale became a kind of critical reflection, interrupting the institution of the biennial and reworking it towards a different end, a project of transforming the terms of the inquiry. The '89 Biennale replaced the pocketed national space that characterized the biennial as an exhibition form with a transnational organization based around ideas, basically. It opened up the space of what counted as contemporary art to include new locations and different modes of production. It conceived of an exhibition as a constellation of related arguments rather than a single essay, and of a biennale as equally a process of display and discussion. And finally, and not least, it imagined that the entire enterprise could be exciting for non-specialists and not just for professionals. In all of this, the third Biennale anticipated curatorial trends that would emerge in ensuing decades. It's probably worth noting that the so-called discursive turn in curatorial practice, whether in its high theory iteration of new institutionalism or the more prosaic American version of Museum 2.0, seems to have reached an impasse, stalling out as yet another doctrine of the exhibition. And now we begin to hear calls for a return to exhibitions as exhibitions. This is normal, I suppose, in the history of ideas and practices. Ideas are formulated to solve a problem. They eventually become themselves the problem and get reformulated into new solutions. I guess it's my hope that in making a place for Havana's early experiment within the broader context of exhibition histories, this book might refresh some of the questions that the Biennale raised and which we're still contending with today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for your talk, of giving us sort of behind-the-screens look of the book, going into the biennial, and also how many factors and sort of global developments converged in that year. We can think about it because we're going to have a short break. I hope I can welcome you back at 5 9:15, which is in 10 minutes. There's some coffee and tea in the lobby, and you can actually buy the book in the back of the room at the table, which is also now used as a chair, I see. But you can buy it there, so please do, and I'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everybody. If people would like to take a seat, we're going to start again. I'd like to thank Rachel Weisz for a really fantastic first presentation, a taste of what's yet to come, I'm sure, from everybody. I'm beginning to think, I really hope maybe sometimes there isn't a bona fide archive for exhibitions, because what she has sort of explained to us or presented to us here is so evident in the book, the kind of energy, the cacophony of voices, the intelligent attempt to kind of bring together a past and a present and a kind of examining of a legacy from many different perspectives, which perhaps, you know, avoids a kind of official archive or you know, because of a lack of an official archive or an official kind of cultural memory, allows a different and very intelligent kind of exploration that, you know, I'm sure we'll start to unpack as the evening goes on. So thank you very much, Rachel, for that. I'm just going to explain before I introduce Gerardo that after that we're going to have a talk here, a kind of moderated discussion, and we're also going to invite to the table Dirila Lazo, who's an independent curator, who's also been involved at a later stage, perhaps a later generation, in the Havana Biennial. So it's a chance to kind of again discuss the legacy in a different way. So I'll be welcoming onto the stage after this lecture Rachel, Dirila and Gerardo to discuss in more depth. So I hope you're thinking of your questions for that conversation, that we can really have kind of a robust conversation. And the other thing I'd like to say is that we're very lucky to have tonight also one of the driving forces behind After All, Pablo Lafuente, who's also been very involved in developing this book. So I'm sure if you have questions about After All and these extraordinary publications and this investigation, you can also ask him, and I'm sure he'll have some good questions from the floor too, I hope. So now, without further ado, I'd really like to welcome, we're honoured to have Gerardo Mosquera, who of course was one of the key figures behind this biennial, who will give us his kind of bird's eye view and perhaps his look back at this biennial. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the Rijksakademie and the Stedelijk Museum for joining forces to organize this presentation and other joint activities, which is something I think that quite welcome in the current situation here in the Netherlands. I think I should remark first that I was part of the Havana Biennial curatorial team during the 3 first editions, so 1984, 86, and 89. And then as a result of the conflicts I had, I resigned immediately after the 1989 edition, so the one presented in the book, and became an independent curator. So this is something I have to be grateful to the Havana Biennial, you know, to becoming like an independent professional. So in a way, this, I think, reflects the complexities, intricacies, contradictions involved. So on the one hand, I will, you know, I wrote down some ideas here, which are more kind of praising the biennial, but at the end, I realized that I resigned at the end. So in a way, this is quite paradoxical. But well, anyway, I'm going to read this, and I think that we will allow some time and for discussions. To see and to think exhibitions on themselves as signifying bodies is a recent tendency. Before, we used to deal only with art and artists, ignoring the plots through which art was presented or excluded. This delay in taking into account the role of the exhibition is remarkable if we think that the artwork never communicates its meaning and its aesthetics in a state of purity, in a limbo. But as part of a visual discourse modulated by the show by the show in which it is made visible and its background, or as belonging to a particular context, as Louise Lawler has shown in her photos. The artwork is no way alone in its space, and its space is never its own place completely. The book that we are now launching is very important for two main reasons. First, as a crucial contribution to the field of exhibition studies, the new discipline that investigates exhibitions as entities that create meaning and discourse, and which respond to historical situations and to specific professional, social, and cultural contexts. The other reason to welcome this publication is intertwined with the previous one. It discusses a historic event that changed the world of biennial making and global art circulation, and which had remained quite overlooked. The publication responds to the vision of After All Books to examine how art was made global, and will be followed by another volume on Les Magiciens de la Terre, the polemical exhibition that also took place in 1989 in Paris. Just some 15 years ago, what was called international art and international art circulation were mainly restricted to North American and Western European practices. The two events discussed in these books were a turning point to a new era of more truly global circulation of art. Both corresponded to what Arjun Appadurai refers to as the lean outward, in which, quote, history leads you outward to link patterns of changes to increasingly larger universes of interaction, end quote. However, everybody knows about the Jean-Hubert Martin's landmark exhibition, which has been broadly discussed. While the role of the Havana Biennial suffered from what Gayatri Spivak would call an itinerary of silencing due to its peripheral location. This happened despite the biennial, on the contrary to Les Magiciens, was pioneering the way in which globalization will take shape in art, and how new biennials and other international art events will be organized in the near future. The Havana Biennial outed the biennial practice to the world, away from mainstream canons and hierarchies. It queered biennials. Part of this was because Havana, as Rafael Niemciovic has indicated, established the contemporary biennial as a platform for the critique of modernity, reflecting the new transnational, multicultural, and diasporic identities. For this author, the biennial was, quote, the crucial event for the history of the contemporary biennial, end quote. I remember that when After All publishers addressed me about my contribution to the volume, to this volume that we are launching here, I advocated dedicating the book to the second biennial instead of the third one. And Rachel might remember about this. My point was that this second edition, which opened in 1986, was the first global show of contemporary art ever. A mammoth, uneven, chaotic bunch of more than 50 exhibitions and events that gathered 690 artists from 57 countries 3 years before Le Magicien, focusing on post-colonial contemporary art and not on traditional and ritual practices, as it was the case in Martin's landmark show. Thus, it was the second Havana Biennial, and not the third one, or Le Magicien, that inaugurated the new era of internationalization in which, still with many silences, deficits, and imbalances, we live today. The new situation involves the increasing role of a range of new artistic and cultural subjects and new art scenes around the globe. A plurally constructed international art language, the acknowledgement of different modernities, and the agency of multiple contemporaneities. The biennial's variegated structure made it a true urban festival that involved the whole city. More importantly, never before had artists, curators, critics, and scholars from all over the world met horizontally. What made the second and third biennials historic was not their curating, but their curatorial perspective. If their curating suffered from the vastness and swiftness of the task and the curator's lack of knowledge, preparation, and organization, the event's curatorial standpoint was the result of a clear vision in the making towards the internationalization of contemporary art that we enjoy nowadays. Anyway, Teresa Glido, acting as After All series editor, convinced me about the pertinence of working on the book about the third biennial instead, on the grounds of this event being the true consolidation of the Havana Biennial's vision and goals. The 1989 edition introduced radical curatorial changes that moved the biennial away from the Venice and Sao Paulo paradigms, launching a new model that influenced the way in which the new biennials were organized. These transformations included to base the whole event, shows, conferences, workshops, etc., on a general theme, a centralized curation with no national representations, and the eradication of awards that, well, Rachel has mentioned. Other orientations from the previous biennials were kept and increased, like a lively involvement of the city and the media, to the point that there was a feeling of the biennial being everywhere around the city. And the decision of conceiving the event not as a show, but as a complex organism, and Rachel also used this term, organism, consisting of diversified activities and not only exhibitions. Also, a more coherent overall organization was achieved. All these issues and more have been thoroughly analyzed by Rachel Weisz in her excellent essay for the book. No one could be better prepared for the task. Rachel has both the scholarly skills, the experience of visiting the early biennials, and first-hand knowledge about Cuba and Cuban art. She is both a researcher and an eyewitness, and her text addresses in depth the complexities and contradictions of the event and positions it critically in its historical context. A general problem for researchers in exhibition studies comes from the exhibition's ephemeral character. To analyze shows that took place previously to the expansion of digital technology, researchers have to work from their memory, the memories of others, and from published reviews and documentation, which is frequently difficult to obtain. Of course, there's the catalog, but it's often limited and or biased. For the third Havana Biennial, the situation was worse due to shortages of cameras, films, and other means in Cuba as a result of the regime's policy. The After All editorial team has done a fantastic job tracking down and collecting dispersed images and and information for the book. This proved to be very difficult and was a remarkable accomplishment. Paradoxically, since the editors had to rely on random and unprofessional material by Rachel and Kamnitzer, I have to say that the visual image of the third Havana Biennial given by the book is quite incomplete and uneven, but it was the one that was possible. There is a certain amount of idealism in every biennial, even in every exhibition. This idealism comes from narratives of enlightenment and humanism that have been deeply built in art. Although we are living cynical times, it is true that around every biennial hovers a fairy feeling of the event contributing something positive to the spirit, even to make this world better. Difficult task. On the other hand, biennials' practical goals are frequently the result of optimism about the functional possibilities of culture, which sometimes prove to be a failed myth, on the short run at least. In its initial heroic editions, the Havana Biennial was the ultimate utopian biennial. The Biennale was born in the utopian context of the Cuban Revolution out of the will of transforming international power relations on art circulation and legitimation. Not less idealistic were the more down-to-earth political and ideological ends the Biennale involved. The Biennale was part of Cuba's strategy of organizing every kind of international event in all fields as a way of publicizing its political messianism and building a good image. Representation and self-branding have always been a priority for the Cuban regime that has surpassed the country's scale and economic situation. The first biennial took place in 1984 and therefore became the fourth international biennial after Venice, Sao Paulo, and Sydney, and the sixth huge international periodic art event to be established, following the aforementioned biennials, the Carnegie International and Documenta. It was a vast show, but restricted to Latin America for reasons of logistics and organization, and was launched as a sort of test and training experience. The biennial was supported by the Cuban government, who was in turn subsidized by the USSR at the time. The reason for the Cuban regime's intense expenditure in cultural activity has always been ideological, with a strong international side. We can consider this either to be utopianism or political expediency, or both. However, we would restrict our view on this policy if we merely think that its purposes were only to promote socialist ideas, to fight against Cuba's isolation imposed by the USA, to showcase a good image of the country, and to co-opt artists and intellectuals. Cuba had a genuine Latin American and Third World cultural and political agenda that was sometimes at odds with the Soviet Union's communist orthodoxy. And as part of the role of beachhead for USSR policy that Cuba had always played, its peculiar character was used those days to try to sustain Cuba as a third world leader. Well, and I have been using here the term third world within an evolved meaning and in an operational way, aware of the ins and outs that it involves. Well, on all this, Cuba was competing with China, which opposed the Soviet bloc and was also trying to accomplish that role. But of course, we beat China. Therefore, on the one hand, for historical, political, and cultural reasons, Cuba had a true inclination towards Caribbean, Latin American, and post-colonial cultures. On the other, this inclination was exploited and supported by the Soviet bloc to gain political influence over third world countries. In this institutional background, here you can see the complex chess game that was taking place, on the political level, the geopolitics, the cultural agendas, and everything mixed up. Well, in this background I have described very roughly, there were some positive aspects that made possible the historic role played by the biennial. The Cuban regime launched it pursuing political goals, remaining unaware of the biennial's artistic and cultural scope and importance, but was smart enough to leave its construction to a team of specialists from the visual arts field. The government left considerable room for the curators involved, imposing only decisions that could have a direct political impact. It was also clear that for organizing an event dealing with such a vast range of countries and artists, it would not be possible to keep a restrictive Marxist ideological frame. So the biennial was conceived as an open space for contemporary artists, critics, and curators and scholars from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the Middle East, including their diasporas in Europe and North America, to meet and become acquainted with each other's works and ideas beyond ideology or sheer politics. The Biennial created a platform for research and promotion at a time when artists from the so-called peripheries, most of the world, were unknown beyond their local contexts. Of course, by so doing, the regime was successfully contributing to fulfill its practical goal of becoming a third world leader. But at the same time, it was satisfying a critical need for contemporary art outside the mainstream, and was giving room for a sincere commitment by the biennial's curators to work inspired by a vision they considered of global importance. It is crucial to take into account that the biennial was born in the context of a radical cultural renovation that was being carried out in Cuba by a new generation of visual artists and critics that arose at the end of the 70s, also mentioned by Rachel. This so-called new Cuban art, to which, by the way, Rachel has recently devoted a book, which is probably, again, like the main book on the subject. Well, this new art transformed forever the conservative official culture that had prevailed during the decade, so during the 70s in Cuba, pushing the Ministry of Culture, to which the biennial reported, towards a more liberal policy. The young artists developed a critical, postmodern, internationally open approach to art, creating a new liberal climate that was crucial to shape the biennial's nature and to provide a vivacious environment for it. The Biennale's idealistic agenda hit its target and triggered the foundation of other biennials in the so-called peripheries. As Nieboyemski has pointed out, Havana, a quote, marked a turn in biennial history, the birth of a new breed of contemporary biennials born of a global context and the start of their proliferation, for good and for bad. Well, I mean, I end the quote in proliferation. This is my comment to Niemcovic's quote. Segregation was very critical in the visual arts by the mid-80s. The pre-existent periodic international art events from the Venice Biennial to Documenta were far from being global. Only 5% of the artists who had participated were not from Western Europe or North America. Thus, the Havana Biennial created a new, truly international other space while acting at the same time as a gigantic Salon des Réfugiés that involved most of the world. To borrow a notion from world art studies, the biennial worlded the all-elitist biennial institution. The importance of this breakthrough at the time is more evident when we witness that even today a deficit in South-South linkage and interaction persists. Thanks to the Biennale organizers' efforts, the early 90s editions, I would say that the fourth and the fifth editions, managed to keep the event's character. But the Biennale evolved to become one more standard international art exhibition today. Instead of activating its innovative orientation, experimenting new methods and strategies. And this was partially a result of losing its acting utopia. In Louis Kamnitzer's words, the Biennale mutated from, quote, an alternative independent forum to finally become a provider of the international market, end quote. The Biennial has also become a paradoxical global event that is always curated by almost the same official team over the years. People who were working with me are still there, you know, so. As a result, lack of curatorial focus and of rigorous, uncompromised selection of artists has always affected the biennales. Such centralism has predisposed the Biennial to a certain authoritarian, bureaucratic, and even repressive stance, as in the case of indirect or straightforward censorship that has occurred in the last editions. Cuba was unable to reinvent itself in the new post-Cold War situation and became a fossil. Instead of responding to new challenging times, it introduced minor changes to keep everything the same. Although the Biennale's vision was already forging new times, the event was not independent enough to escape the destiny of the country that had created it. Thank you.
Somebody had to. Thank you so much, Gerardo. That was extraordinarily interesting. Perhaps I'd like to take up immediately from what you've said, and perhaps it could be a question that we could unfold and direct to all of our three panelists. I was struck by what you said in relation to the idea that perhaps in the biennials that you had worked on, that maybe the curatorial work wasn't optimum, but the curatorial thinking was the thing. And then also later you kind of discussed ideas of the heroic, the optimistic, the idealistic. And then it drew me back to an idea that you'd said you'd kind of become an independent curator after that. And then I thought about Rachel in her biography saying she was a lapsed curator. And I was kind of wondering, could we talk a little bit more about what this idea of the curatorial is in your eyes, as distinct from, or the curatorial thinking could be or is, in terms of what your critique might be?
Well, I think that something that perhaps was also inaugurated by the Havana Biennial was the fact that nowadays we curators, we have to work from a certain awareness of our ignorance. So the old golden days in which you knew what was going on in art, you know, that meant that it was like 200 names, and you knew everything. You organized the exhibitions, and you know, it was Joseph Beuys here, and you know, Andy Warhol there, and you know, so that's over. Now we curators, we have to work from ignorance. You know, we are acquainted that we just have a certain control over a few names, a few things going on here and there. So you can imagine the Havana Biennial. We have this will, you know, to open up and to create like a forum, a space for the whole world. So, but we knew nothing. We had to, you know, curate on the making, traveling, investigating. So that's as a result of that, I would say that the biennials, I mean the art that was shown, it was quite uneven, and as a result of our lack of knowledge and of organization and the swiftness of the task. But I think that what was clear, it was this vision of opening up to a contemporary art in a global sense. So on the contrary of Les Magiciens, where Martin, who is a colleague I respect a lot, and I think that the magician, even though it was strongly criticized for good reasons, but anyway, it was a landmark exhibition. I mean, there was this thing about including like religious and ritual art, mainly so the peripheral countries were mainly represented by that. So it was like a division of tasks. So for the Western artists was, what we call contemporary art, and for the others it was mainly like traditional stuff. So for us it was very clear that we wanted to show and to get together a post-colonial contemporary art practices, and we were accused of being westernized by that, because they say, well, no, the real stuff is the traditional stuff, so the pre-colonial one. These sort of artists are, like colonized. But we were very clear about that, and we, were continue with that. And I think that was one of the main important issues here.
Thank you. Rachel, would you like to comment on that, or even just the impetus of bringing the book together as a kind of curatorial example?
We were talking earlier about how actually a lot of the work in the Biennial was like really not good, which was a big surprise to me when when I started working on the project, because I had this like intense memory of what an extraordinary event it was, and of how much I'd learned, and of like the energy that people had, and the will to interact, and when I went back and looked at the slides, I was like really worried about like how do you advocate for an exhibition of work that you can't advocate for, and what Gerardo was saying about the difference maybe between curating and curation is the point that to me the real insight of the Biennial was that something happens when people see work and when artists encounter each other. And it was an event that was focused on that rather than on like a parade of objects. And so I tried to take a cue from that in putting the book together and make it an encounter of different perspectives. Also, anything to do with Cuba is the site of gigantic arguments, so I felt like those should also be present. So
perhaps it's more about the thinking around staging the encounter rather than necessarily the precise works that are in that encounter. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
or no. I don't.
Also, you are young people. You didn't.
Not that young, but
sure. You didn't experience the time when the international circulation of art was extremely segregated. Now there are artists around, even from Central Asia, from countries that really. But those days it was extremely segregated. Even reduced to Western Europe or certain Western European countries and North America, and so nothing for the rest. So it was like a great breakthrough just to open up.
Maybe this is a great moment to bring Durella in as the advocate for the younger generation. But just to maybe, I mean, obviously you've worked and you've lived in the legacy of this, and I mean, there's always a danger of, idealizing or fantasizing or historicizing something, and that's what I think is so great about this book, that it allows for a kind of cacophonous kind of consideration on some levels. But it would be lovely to hear how you've been working in the legacy of something like this in Cuba.
Yeah.
And elsewhere.
First of all, thank you everyone that makes this possible this evening. Thank you, Rachel, for your essay, because when I was reading the book, I really realized how little I knew about the biennial. And for me, the book is more like the unofficial history of the biennial, although it's talking about the official history. Because there are so many facts about the political and economical that are unspoken in Cuba. I'm glad that you mentioned that the difference between the format, what you remember about the biennial and the actual works, because in my experience, I remember the first time I heard about the Havana Biennial. I was here in Netherlands because I was at the Apple, so I went to this conference that was held in Utrecht. And I heard about Sarah Marahat. He talks about the biennial, and his discourse was about the format, but he didn't mention any of the works. And for me, it was like a huge difference between how people from outside looks at the Havana Biennial and how the Havana Biennial it looks from the inside. Mm-hmm. Because I think that for younger generation, it's like a festival. It's like the way, or even 3 years, because it doesn't happen every 2 years, as the name, is when things really happen. Because there is a lot of artists that are coming. I think it's worth mentioning the fact that Cuban artists are more and more living abroad, but they all come back for the biennial, and they struck what they sing with political gestures. So somehow it's this encounter that you have not only with the international, but also with your own context, because things are not really that enthusiastic the rest of the time. So I was more or less contrasting these two perspectives, which I think is worth to mention.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Gerard, you pointed a little bit at that there's definitely been, since the biennial industry sort of increased exponentially, there's been a kind of a sedimentation maybe, or a common sense of what a biennial is now in a different way, that it is the international in a different way than that kind of moment of segregation, and that it is all-inclusive, and that in fact we all become these intense content providers for a huge amount of sort of the cultural industry. So I'm just wondering, is that part of your kind of cynicism around what it is that the biennial sort of becomes when it isn't a kind of thinking force?
It was addressed to
any of you.
I mean, we have to, like, when you're talking about utopia, you have to realize that you're being utopian. And in a way, I mean, I also have felt very disappointed in what happened with the Biennale. But on the other hand, it happened, the kind of luminescent moment happened when it could, and was incredibly important and influential. And I think, I think part of the way I understand it is that it has been both a unique project, and it's also tracked to much larger forces, and as Cuba has. I mean, Cuba had a particular status in the 80s, and which was not possible to maintain after 1989. So, I think that the other day someone said, okay, so the biennial is finished, what's next? And I think like the germ of what's next is in this idea of being at war with its own form. And so I'm like not that depressed about the Biennale. I feel like it gives us a lot to work with, and it's exhausted, but people are doing other things.
I think one of the things that became very clear both in your presentation and also, Gerardo, both your presentation and the discussion in the book, is that the politics is played out in the production too. You know, it's sometimes I think that within contemporary curating there's kind of an evasion of the context, like we're in this great international sort of white zone. But actually the tussles between official culture, the pragmatics of the time, the urgencies are actually where the exciting kind of decisions get made. And I think that's what, for me, is very valuable about the context of the book, that you actually kind of read into and understand that those are things that actually generate the possibility and the character of what happened. And that often is not discussed in detail around a lot of international biennials.
Yes, indeed, and that's why I appreciate so much Rachel's essay for the book, because it's really dealing in depth with the intricacies involved in the whole process. at the historical moment in which it took place. So it's really, I think that the book is not like praising the biennial or just launching it as a discovering this event, but is critically analyzing and positioning it for the first time. I mean, it's the Niemcovic's essay, which is also research on the Havana in relation to Venice. So this author has done like a thorough investigation about the Havana Biennale's role vis-a-vis Venice. And it's very interesting in the way, and he says, well, you know, the Havana just changed the paradigm and introduced a new model for a new breed. He uses this term, breed, a new breed of biennials that are proliferating nowadays.
Mm-hmm. I have lots of questions, but I really think there's so many people here that I'd like to already throw it out to the floor. So if there's some questions already, we'll start and maybe we can just intermingle. Okay. Do we need a microphone? Okay. We've got somebody over here.
Which one?
In the front row here. Great, thanks.
Yeah, I don't have so much of a question, but a remark. I've been so lucky to have seen the biennial in that year, and what struck me, and I relate to what Gerardo said now, in relation to the Venice biennial, what struck me then, and also the biennial afterwards, the Havana Biennial afterwards, was the involvement of the public. It was so remarkable how the Cubans embraced this biennial and the kind of interactive exhibition avant la lettre, so to say. That was really, I think that was for me, the most utopian part of this biennial.
I'm very glad that you mentioned that because, you know, people might think, well, Rachel and Gerardo are looking back nostalgically, you know, to the good days, the old good days. But this is true that took place, really. Yeah.
No, just as a kind of illustration, I think it was about the, with regard to the second Biennale, but Gillian Yanis was telling me about how the CDRs, the like neighborhood watch groups in like every neighborhood of the city, organized parties for the artists. There would be like artists who'd go and do, visiting for the Biennale, who would go and do something in the neighborhood, some kind of workshop. And then everyone had this big street party for them, like imagine.
So it's like, if I can't dance, I won't be part of your Biennale.
I couldn't agree more. Any more questions?
You mentioned the quality of the art in the Biennale, and I have a question from an artist's point of view in Latin America, perhaps. What model, if the biennial doesn't necessarily contribute to the quality of the work or artistic production in countries, you know, not in Western Europe or in North America, what model would contribute to artistic production there? Do you understand my question?
Yeah.
I mean, if the biennial is contributing to the biennial itself or exhibitions becoming globalized, but the actual work, what contributes to that? What model from a curator's point of view would help?
Well, we were inventing a model. And it's not that we were trying to gather like bad painting, or as Marsha Tucker once, was advocating for. The problem is that, I mean, the choice was, let's try to do it, which is a big challenge, the way we can, and keep this going. So it's not that we were not interested in quality or in choosing work, but sometimes we had to to get what was available, but to make sure that to create this space for encounter and exchange. But of course, in the countries in which we had, more knowledge about or networking, the selection was much better. It's not to say that everything was shit, not at all. But, in many other cases, we had to rely on the sources we had. And sometimes it happened that we, showed some work, and what was sent by the country, the participating country, was not what we had chosen. So many contradictions and many problems. But for us, this was like a second level. The main thing was to try to get the project going on and to create this new space, opening up doors.
Yeah, I have more like a question for Gerard and Rachel, and it's about the format of the biennial, because, for example, the next edition is getting rid of the old venues. They are trying to reinvent the biennial and start...
You mean the next one in May?
Yeah, the next one. So what's it about the format of the biennial that have captured so much attention, and do you think that if the format will change as it will be proved to, as it will change, that will it will less interesting, or since the artworks are not the very, the standpoint?
Mm-hmm. I'll try to answer this without being too cynical. First of all, the Biennale became well known in my part of the world largely because of Gerardo and because of the artists working in the city. And people started to hear about what was going on. The experimentation of the Biennale was absolutely of a piece with everything else that was happening with visual art at the time, and with the way it was being written about and interpreted, and the way that it was being imagined in relation to the life of the city and in relation to the political discourse of the country. It was interesting to me the moment at which the Biennale's language switched from being one of participation to being one of interventions. And I think that happened maybe, 2 or 3 editions ago. And at that point, it seemed to be like just another Biennale that wanted people to come in and do sambas in the street, basically. Literally. And it's not clear what the next one will be. It's not encouraging because the people who are involved are not specialists in art. But still, I feel like just the simple fact of its persistence and of its continuing congruence with its conditions, which means not only conditions in Cuba, but conditions in the art system more broadly, makes it really important to think about, to look at. So, the one thing, when you were talking earlier about how the Biennale curatorially exists within its context, that's absolutely right, but any curatorial project does. It's not because Cuba's a certain kind of state. Any biennial in particular, because of the scale and the writ of the project, is contending with all kinds of forces that are civic and fiscal and political, and that have to do with artistic discourse, by the way. So as a contextual project, I feel like it still has a great deal of importance. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, I had a question really about that curatorial aspect, because you mentioned in talking about the series of books that one aspect of it is this current interest, this focus on curatorial practice, and you used the word the professional point of view. And I'm curious about the conversations that happened between the second and third biennial that brought you to the point where you eliminated the countries and where you embraced thematics and where you really did change the paradigm by which such a massive exhibition would be structured. Can you give us a little sense of what the professional discourse about curation was that led to that decision?
Well, it's a difficult question for me because, I mean, I have to say, I was the part of the team who was really strongly advocating against the awards. I was advocating for the thematic show and to avoid national representation. And it was very hard to achieve that. I mean, this was a discussion of the team, within the team, since the first biennial. But you know, I mean, this tradition is very heavy. And so that was the biennial tradition. And apart from that, there was also like a line in Cuba. Cuba has been organizing different festivals in the arts before the Bienal. The film festival, which is still going on, the theater festivals, mainly in Latin America, literary contests. And so the award was like a main part of that. And the bureaucrats were very concerned about the awards. You know, they wanted to keep the awards because, you know, the awards are very sexy. And, you know, you get the media and, well, you know, it's kind of a mental set. And, but the discussions were so rich and so intense that we managed to change so as early as in the third edition, while the Sao Paulo Biennial has kept the national representation until very early, like a couple of biennials before. So they got rid of that, but they kept it. I mean, so I think this is telling about how intense and were the discussions and that the minds were in a way open and open the possibility for us, you know, to create a different model. That was more, because as Rachel said, you know, this is not a competition. If we are trying to create like a space for getting together and know each other and discuss ideas, what are the awards making here? And also the national representation. I mean, we wanted to discuss issues, so we have to go to themes and to discuss different hot issues at the time and not dealing, you know, with the national representations, and also you will get involved with the, you know, this narrow mind, you know, in the different countries, and, you know, so, I mean, that was the way, you know, it was built on their discussion.
I have a question for Gerardo with reference to the way that the young Cuban artists participated in the 1989 edition. Also the way that Coco Fusco refers in her review to the humor exhibition, the way that the young Cuban artists use humor as a sort of political way of intervening for that edition. How would you position that generation of Cuban artists and how they worked under censorship and a sort of exclusion of China and a pro-Soviet approach and all of those internal conditions?
Yeah, well, the tradition of humor exhibition was one of the reasons why I resigned. Yeah, to me it was, how do you call in boxing, like a low punch, right? Yeah, because, I mean, it was a way to diminish the importance of this critical art that was taking place in Cuba. It was very intense. And just to put these artists in a sort of ghetto exhibition, so the tradition of humor, together with a newspaper cartoonists and you know, it was a totally different context. So this is not the art It's not in the other shows, but this is humor, together with the cartoons, etc. I think it was a way, to manipulate the whole thing. So I was really upset by that. And also because, the biennial was also a result, not of the curators, of we, the team. It was also a result of what was going on in Cuba. The artists, the new Cuban artists shaped the biennial's spirit. There was something that was going on there, a renovation in the art. So there was a very nice environment. It was like fertile soil for the biennial to grow up. So to me, this was a sort of a manipulation that I really hated.
I actually have a very short question, I think mostly for Rachel, but of course the others can respond as well. Maybe more related to the larger picture of exhibition history, which is indeed is sort of the guiding thread in this series. I guess I speak for most of us that we haven't actually been there. So we sort of re-experience, or we experience this particular exhibition through the book, or through sort of the resources that were so skillfully sort of dug out by you. But I'm very curious. How did you, in your research, I think like in art history, if you have an art object, you always mostly have the opportunity to go to a space and actually see the artwork. I think exhibition history goes to the heart of what an exhibition is, whether it's an event that you actually had to participate in and be at, or is it something that you can experience, through books or through sort of secondary sources. And I'm quite curious how you experienced that in doing the research, which obviously you've been occupied for very long with, and was that a consideration, and how did you exactly, deal with that?
You're doing a second-hand version in a way. It's kind of like the fight that everyone was having last year about re-performance. And additionally, it was like really a problem that we didn't have good visual representation of what was there, and didn't remember what was next to what, and just endless kind of deficiencies in how we could represent it. On balance, it's like any history is kind of a bargain with the devil, isn't it? It's like you say, well, I'm going to do the best version that I can. And there's a clear, the thing that was extremely helpful was that After All had laid out a very clear context and purpose. And once you're like focused about why you're bothering to recount or re-narrate an exhibition that you can only do so imperfectly, then you can say, all right, so within that purpose, I understand that this is important to highlight, for example. And so I guess that was how yeah.
I have a very quick question, and then I'll take maybe one or two more from the floor. Has the book been interestingly or discussed in Havana in relation? Do you know?
That was my question.
I don't know. I'm like...
I haven't heard from book in Havana. Actually, I asked you if you have some feedback from the Havana organizers.
Not a peep.
Yeah.
Not yet. Maybe it's early days.
I don't know.
I'm really curious about it.
Buying a ticket for May, and I hope I can get off the plane.
Okay,
But they were involved in...
No, not at all. We I don't know how much we want to go into this, but we had asked the Wilfredo Lam Center to help us with archival materials, and they were unable to do so.
No comment from Gerardo? You don't know why?
No, it's a very candid question. Of course, they won't like the book. The authorities. So I'm pretty afraid that the book is not going to circulate.
Okay.
Other than, person to person.
Do we have some more questions from the floor? Maybe just one or two more?
You mentioned also the Magicien de la Terre exhibition, and I would like to know, in exhibition history, most of the time the Magicien de la Terre exhibition is seen as the first exhibition in which the first global exhibition, but you stated that it was more the Havana Biennial, which was the first global exhibition. Why is it that in most literature the Magicien de la Terre is seen as the first one?
Well, good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, it was completely overlooked. I mean, it's not the same to put an exhibition at the Beaubourg in Paris than to organize it in Havana. So, I mean, this is really telling about all these exclusions, and that's why this book is also so important, because it's contributed to the history writing.
You were using a quote from Spivak recent, which I think is really important. There's another one I really like from Okwi Emazor, where he talks about epistemological violence. And it's really, I think it's really important to think about what is done to when one excludes.
Yeah.
Last question.
Maybe it's not a question as much as an observation in relation to your question. I think that apart from issues of marketing, which obviously Magicien could do better, no? Maybe more reach. There is an interesting use of terminology, I think, because, and what that terminology may not imply, because in some way Magicien calls itself the global exhibition, while I think Havana Biennial didn't. And the globalism of Magicien is an abstract globalism. No?
Right.
I mean, it's these individuals from dots around the world. But the way that the catalog, I mean, I didn't go to see the exhibition. My access is through the catalog and through the work that Rachel has done and what you have written is a globalism understood with a certain geographical remit, which is a south-south globalism. And I think that that's important to remark. I mean, it's not a globalism as seen through the eyes of Paris or New York or whatever. It's a globalism that is trying to build different alliances. And because of that, it's partial. It's a funny, paradoxical term. And that's perhaps partly why that globalism is not recognized as this, easy. Or maybe it's not that easy, but it's got not only a geographical remit, but also a political remit of contestation that the other one doesn't have. It's much more abstract. And I think that is important. It's important to make that distinction.
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely. Anybody like to elaborate further?
No, I agree.
No, I think that's beautifully put, and a very good point to end indeed. I'd really like to thank so much all of our participants, Gerardo, Lilia, and Rachel, and of course the Rijksakademie and the Stedelijk for welcoming us all here today. So thank you.
And someone we should not forget to thank, of course, is Annie for so aptly moderating the discussion. Outside there are some drinks, so please stay for a bit and have a drink and talk a bit more. As I said at the beginning, I hope to welcome you back here for the next Stedelijk Rijksakademie event in March and April and May as well. It will be announced on the website of the Rijksakademie and the Stedelijk soon, so keep an eye on them. And of course, come to other Stedelijk at events as well. Thank you for coming and see you next time.
And that's the thing. Okay, let's have a drink.
And you did like all this preparation and you didn't get to use.
Oh no, I don't care. I mean, it's more, it's just in case. No problem. No. Yeah.